We live in contentious times, and I love this cartoon from the book Let My People Laugh. It kind of summarizes how we sometimes respond to these difficulties. And I want to tell a story. I normally begin with some news that you might have missed, and sometimes it's humorous. I begin this with a little trepidation because I want to avoid politics. But in politics, there is the American story. And in this story, I want you ultimately to focus on form, because it does apply in some way to the Bible lesson that we have today. So let me begin with a summary of the situation that was published in The Week, which is a news magazine. It comes out every week. I really like it because of its summaries. And it says, Houston voters on Tuesday repealed an ordinance that sought to ban discrimination over gender identity and sexual orientation. The city council approved the protections, which are not guaranteed under state law, in May, but opponents, including conservative politicians and pastors, won a court fight to put the matter to a referendum. Opponents said that the measure would have to let male sexual predators into women's bathrooms. The city's lesbian mayor, Anise Parker, blamed the defeat on fear-mongering and deliberate lies. Well, it's all true. It's factual. And we live in contentious times. But as such, process matters. And that's true as far as the story goes, so I'm going to give you the rest of the story. This right now is a week after the November elections in 2015. In Houston, the country's fourth largest city, in April of 2014, Mayor Anise Parker announced a new measure. It was called the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, or HERO. And the city council has the right to pass ordinances unilaterally. And they fast-tracked it to the city council to be effective immediately. They centralized the investigations with a $500 daily fine for businesses accused of violations. Well, in the city council meeting, there was standing room only as protesters arrived and several pastors spoke. The council delayed the vote, and citizens sent in 11,000 emails, which overwhelmed the servers. At the next meeting to consider the bill, the mayor was very clever, and she let the backers know early so they could sign up to speak, effectively eliminating the opposition voice. Some of the city council members asked that the pastors be allowed to speak, but they were voted down. And so they walked out, the pastors walked out, and emptied about 2/3 of the room. Well, HERO passed 11-6. The opponents, though, felt disrespected and disdained, and they felt the mayor smirked at them openly. Their only option was to gather signatures for a referendum, and they were under the gun. The deadline was 30 days, and they needed 17,269 signatures. Well, they got 55,000 signatures, and on August 1st, the city secretary, Anna Russell, sent a memo to the city council saying that she had enough signatures. She stopped counting at 19,000. That's 1,761 more than required. Well, Mayor Parker called Russell in, and also the city attorney, David Feldman, and he said he found some problems with some forms, and he wanted Russell to include a memo to that effect in her certification. And she did. Well, that afternoon, the mayor and the attorney general held a press conference without the city secretary, and they claimed that the attorney general had the authority to disqualify signatures on those pages. The 35,000 signatures that Russell didn't count because they weren't necessary were too late. They couldn't be now counted. It was past the deadline. And so the referendum was dead. Well, the opponents then filed suit, and the mayor went after everyone in the opposition. One of the signatures, she claimed, was forged, and it was a signature by a pastor's wife. They went to the churches with a subpoena and demanded that they turn over all sermons, text messages, phone calls, and communications with their parishioners. Well, the Houston Five, some of which of the churches were Grace Community Church, Vietnamese Baptist Church, the Magda Mermuda Ministries, and the River of Oil, the pastors decided to speak in a louder voice and not be intimidated. The state attorney general, who is now the governor, Greg Abbott, denounced the subpoenas. The president of the Interfaith Alliance, a liberal, said that they would have a, quote, dangerous and chilling effect, end quote. Mayor Parker acknowledged that the wording was overly broad, and she said that she'd remove the part about the sermons, but really it was left in place, effectively included in the language. She said, quote, if pastors used pulpits for politics, then their sermons were fair game, end quote. Well, it took 2 weeks before she backed down. In April of 2015, the county district court judge upheld the mayor and her position for invalidating the petitions. But in July of 2015, the Texas Supreme Court came down on the side of the pastors, 9-0. And they said, quote, the legislative power reserved to the people of Houston is not being honored by the city, end quote. The pastors won, but not so quick. The mayor had the wording of the referendum such that a yes vote meant no and a no vote meant yes. They went back to the courts. It went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that a ballot must be straightforward. Yes must mean yes, and no must be no. One of the pastors said one of the most inspirational elements of this whole battle has been the unity of the pastors. Well, why did I tell this story? We're going to have conflict. It's the nature of our society, and there are ground rules that we should abide by. If we abide by the ground rules, then we can have more civil disagreements. And that's part of the problem of the story today. So let's look at Acts 22, it's 22:22 to 30. And it reads, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. They raised their voices and shouted, rid the man of him, he's not fit to live. And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust in the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As he stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported. What are you going to do? He asked. This man is a Roman citizen. The commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. But I was born a citizen, Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, so the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Well, the crowd listened to Paul when he said he was sent to the Gentiles, and then they went nuts. They went wild. Paul was making God available to the Gentiles, but he wasn't requiring that they follow the law or that they be circumcised. In their minds, this was allowing the Gentiles an easy way out. It was disrespectful to God and to them. This was valuing the Gentiles ahead of the Jews. Paul really touched a raw nerve, and the preaching of the Gentiles was intolerable for the chosen people. Inclusive love did not include giving the privilege of membership to the unchosen. They showed their approval in a traditional way. They shouted, they waved their garments, they tore their garments, and they threw dirt in the air. Well, it's our nature to reserve areas of our lives for ourselves. That's relationships, expenditures, unhealed memories, values, and unforgiveness, among others. Likewise, we have some customs reserved for the in crowd. Some of us look down on Americans who can't speak English. I'll be honest, it bothers me to see a man wear a hat indoors, especially in church. Nothing wrong with it, it just bothers me. We profile, like my son-in-law was born in Lebanon, and when he travels, they notice in his passport that he's from the Middle East and make an issue of it. It's kind of our nature, even though we don't like it. Well, each group has its rules that allows us to belong to the group. And, during the Crusades, the fighters were supposed to be Christians. Conscripted crusaders were marched through a river as their baptism, and they held their swords out of the water, excluding that portion from rust and from Christ's control. So the question is, what do we hold out in our commitment to Jesus? How do we respond to those who are not in the club? Homosexuals, drug addicts, ex-cons, the divorced, transsexuals. How are we perceived by others because of our response to those who are different from us? And how can we open up those closets of untouchable subjects? Well, we discuss it like it is in us, or what it is in us. Not what's in them, but in us that needs Christ's healing. And in so doing, we don't deny the rules that govern our own lives. Well, in the last lesson, I said that Paul asked for it. And indeed he did. He faced the crowd initially. He tried to preach to them, and he didn't reveal that he was a Roman citizen. He could have walked away from the scene. Instead, he chose to witness. And now he's about to be beaten to get to the truth. In the last section, we learned that the commander thought Paul was an Egyptian insurgent. Josephus told us that 3 years before, there was a miscreant who had a large army, and this Egyptian led these people against the Romans and promised freedom, but most of them were killed or captured, and the Egyptian escaped. So I was wondering if this is this troublemaker. Commander Claudius Lysias is the leader here of the troops in Jerusalem, and his job is to keep the peace and to collect the taxes. And Paul had a chance to make the peace. And in the commander's eyes, Paul blew it. And he talked to the people, the crowds. He blew it and left too many unanswered questions. So Lysias wanted the truth because he thought the truth might help him keep the peace. So flogging is a standard procedure to find out what the truth is. They would beat someone with a flagellum. That's a rod with bits of bone in it or metal. It was cruel and unusual punishment. It was the predecessor to waterboarding. Recovery would take weeks, if not months, and death was not infrequent. Well, Paul wasn't afraid of dying. He knew that he was going to suffer and die for his faith. And he knew that he had further witnessing to do. So when he was being stretched out and tied to the post for the beating at the very last minute, he then revealed that he was a Roman citizen. He played his ace in the hole. In verse 25, it says, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" Well, of course not. The penalty to the centurion would be death. Cicero, the famous writer of the Roman times, said, "It is a misdeed for a Roman citizen to be bound. It is a crime to be beaten. It's almost as bad as to murder a father as to kill him, that is, a Roman citizen." So the centurion immediately reported this to Claudius Lysias, the commander, and they were dismayed and concerned. "You're a Roman citizen?" Well, Paul explained that he'd been born a Roman citizen. And being born one is a higher status. Rome was about status. Lysias had to pay for his citizenship. Usually it was a large bribe, and a portion of the money would go to Rome. It was a good income for Rome. But people who had to buy their citizenships were in somehow second-class citizens. The bottom line is that Paul deserved a fair trial. So Lysias released him and ordered that he return along with the governing body, that is the Jews, since Paul was a Jew, the Sanhedrin. Maybe the Sanhedrin could find the truth. So Paul retained in the Antonia fortress that night. Now, in Acts 23, 1-10, it says, Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered that those standing near Paul strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there and judge me according to the law, yet you yourselves violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "Well, how dare you insult God's high priest?" And Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil of the ruler of the people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from the Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits. But the Pharisees believe all these things. Well, there was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" Well, the dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. Well, the preacher's commentary points out that this display of Paul, all of this is the display of Paul's humanity, humility, and hope. Luke is not reluctant to show the frailties of the apostles and others, and Paul looked in this situation, though, straight into the eyes of the Sanhedrin. The Greek word means to look fixedly. He didn't face them in fear, but in confidence, eyeball to eyeball. And Paul had a deep passion for his countrymen, the Jews. In Romans 10:1, he said, "Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for the Israelites, that they may be saved." Now he even presumes to call them brothers, and the normal salutation would be rulers of the people and elders of Israel. But calling them brothers put him on equal footing with the court. Paul had been a member of the Sanhedrin years before, and it's fun to wonder whether he knew any of them. Were they just fair weather friends, or were they all new people? In any case, he's ready to burn his bridges, and he says that he's fulfilled his duty in good conscience. Well, what is our duty? In Deuteronomy 6:5, it says to love God with all our heart, soul, and strength. And of course, Jesus and Leviticus added to it in 19:18 to love our neighbor as ourselves. Paul twice in Acts and 21 times in his letters speaks of his clear conscience. But none of us do this perfectly. None of us loves God perfectly or our neighbors. And that statement should have piqued their curiosity. It would have given Paul an opportunity to witness, because we're forgiven by the grace of God, and therefore we can have a clean conscience. But Paul never got there. Now, he was ready to stand trial before them and before God. He was committed to his choices and actions, and inherent in his assertion is, "Are you ready too?" Well, in one, he said he fulfilled his duty, and in Greek the root word is politics, doing one's duty as a citizen. and Paul was a citizen of the kingdom of God. Barclay translates all this by saying, quote, "I am here today because I have been doing God's work," end quote. Now Ananias orders a man standing close to Paul to strike Paul. Ananias had become the high priest in 48 AD, and he reigned for about 10 years. This is in his 9th year. And Josephus describes him as profane, greedy, and hot-tempered. He was held in contempt by many of the Jews because he was pro-Roman. What he did, though, was illegal by commanding Paul, to be struck. In Leviticus 19:15, it says, "Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly." He's not judging his neighbor fairly. Paul hadn't even begun to defend himself. He's being punished, and yet no crime has been established. The judge clearly is not impartial. And this makes Paul angry, with an insult to his character and his intentions. He's angry for the injustice manifested by the Sanhedrin. It's a very human response. This august body should cherish justice, but they're unfair, unjust, and unnecessary. Then in verse 3, Paul says to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." Well, to touch a dead body was a personal defilement, and they whitewashed their tombs. So if you went by them and accidentally touched them, you would get white on your clothes. It transfers to the person. It's that, quote, contaminant, end quote, that makes them unclean. And a wall is something that prevents crossing. Truth can't get past the wall. So the justice is thwarted by a wall of ignorance and arrogance. Paul is effectively calling the high priest a whitewashed, defiled, unclean obstructionist. Barclay makes it a little simpler. He says, "That man sitting there, I never knew a man like that could be high priest of Israel." Paul is eloquent and human. Now, immediately when Paul learns that the offender is the high priest, he renders honor to that position. Because in Exodus 22:28 it says, "Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people." In effect, Paul apologizes for his disparaging words. He shows humility in a difficult situation. He knows that two wrongs don't make a right. So he apologizes not to the high priest, but to the office of the high priest. For most of us, when we're found to be wrong, we just try to defend our mistakes or to justify ourselves. Paul admitted his mistake. Now, you might wonder why Paul didn't recognize the high priest right away. In this picture, it would be obvious. But remember, the meeting's called by the Roman commander, and likely, it's not a regular meeting, so he probably didn't have on his ceremonial robe. And Paul had been out of Jerusalem and only sporadically there over the last 20 years, so he probably didn't really know who Ananias was, or didn't recognize him. And some people suggested that maybe it was eyesight. It's been said in the past that Paul had a thorn in his side, and perhaps it was trachoma, which is a disease of the eyelids that causes very poor vision. But still, he's going eyeball to eyeball with his detractors. And he begins by saying that he is a Pharisee. That means he's an expert in the law. He's been tested, formally tested. He knows the law. And the Pharisees jump in against the Sadducees immediately to protect their turf. And in so doing, they protect Paul. So in 6b it says, "I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." Very inflammatory statement. Rejection is acceptable to the Pharisees, but not to the Sadducees. They believed in angels, the Pharisees, but not the Sadducees. Well, they kind of jump to facts not in evidence, and in 9 they say, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? But that causes further polarization, and the people become violent, so the commander has to rescue Paul. So he spends the night in the Antonia fortress for his own protection. And you may recall that this is the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, and the temple. And this is the Antonia fortress, whose towers look down into the temple area, a sore spot to the Jews. Now Paul, was he playing a clever game, pitting the Sadducees against the Pharisees? Or was he led to say that by the Holy Spirit? Paul simply stated one of the tenets of the faith, that there is life after death. And he spoke of our hope. Our hope. He was humble and he was human. That's Paul. How often do people not hear what is said because they have their own agenda? Church battles can be some of the worst in society. And it's embarrassing when Christians act that way. It made me think of an administrative meeting we had recently in our church. There were no raised voices, a few pointed questions, reasonable answers. Everybody left friends, the way it should be. Well, there was an administrative meeting back in North Carolina, and on the agenda was a line item, a chandelier, $5,000. Well, this old curmudgeon, he was totally against it. And so they asked him, why are you against it? He said, well, first of all, we don't need a chandelier. Second of all, we can't afford a chandelier. And third, nobody knows how to play a chandelier. Question is, how do you respond when you're wrong or when you're the focus of someone else's ire? Acts 23:11-22 begins with Jesus speaking, and the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so must you also testify in Rome." The next morning some of the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We've taken a solemn oath not to eat or drink anything until we've killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you with the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We're ready to kill him before he gets there." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went to the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." And so he took him to the commander. And the centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, has sent for me and asked for me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand and drew him aside and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. But don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting to ambush for him in ambush. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." Well, the commander dismissed the young man with this warning, "Don't tell anyone that you've reported this to me." I think I may have messed up the slides, but I apologize. Remember now, Paul is in the Antonia fortress over here under the protection of Commander Lysias, and Jesus visits with him with praise and promise. In verse 11, the praise is for his faithfulness. It says, "As you have testified about me in Jerusalem." In other words, you were faced with a pretty angry group. You almost got beaten. You were beaten. "As you've testified about me," that's praise. And then a promise. "You must also testify in Rome." In other words, they're not going to kill you. I'm going to get you to Rome. I imagine Paul slept better that night. But there's a conspiracy afoot, and there more than 40 men have vowed not to eat or drink until they kill Paul. And they report to the chief priests and the elders. They're not told to stop or don't do what they're doing, that there's no sentence out for this man. They actually participate in the anticipated assassination. They'll have blood on their hands. But there are two reasons, at least two reasons, why the conspirators are fools. First is that no one has the authority to kill Paul. There's no trial, no sentence, and they therefore would have innocent blood on their hands. They would be guilty of murder. And the second is, people can only live a few days without food and liquid intake. It's a risky vow, particularly when we find out that Paul's going to live in Rome for another 10 years. So I wonder how they weaseled out of this vow, because it ultimately fails. I made a vow once. In a sense, it was a bargain. If I do this, God, you should do that. And it was a fast of sorts. And I failed to keep my side of the bargain. When I realized that I had stiffed the creator of the universe, I was afraid. Very afraid. I should be afraid. Vows are dangerous. And it's best to append to something you want to swear to with, if God is willing, I will. But better yet, mark the words of Jesus where he said, do not swear an oath at all. That's perhaps the best approach. Not perhaps, it is. Now, Paul's nephew reports this conspiracy to Paul, and Paul has him repeated up the chain of command, finally to the commander Lysias, and the commander puts a lid on it. Remember, his obligation is to keep the peace and to protect a Roman citizen. So he needs to get Paul out of there ASAP. Let's finish this up, verses 23 to 35. Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers and 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. And then he wrote a letter as follows. Claudius Lysias, to his Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I learned that he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions of their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of the plot to be carried out against this man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him to Antipatris. And the next day, let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. And the governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear your case when the accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Well, the praetorium is where the governor sits. And the Governor Felix was in Caesarea Maritima, which is on the shore, built by Herod the Great, a spectacular seaport, 60 miles away from Jerusalem. And the first part of the trip is through dangerous territory, ambush country. Can you see the mountains in this thing, the valleys, the defilade? Defilade is places where they can hide. And so Lysias sends an overwhelming force for protection to Antipatris. There are 2 centurions, 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Antipatris is about 25 miles, and when they get there, the rest of the trip is through coastal plain. It's flat, it's very hard to ambush, and so it's pretty safe. And the cavalry remained with Paul for his protection, while the others went back to the Antonia fortress. Paul was under guard for his own safety. Lysias was taking no chance with a Roman citizen. And this is probably some of the best treatment that Paul had had in years. Lysias wrote a letter, a concise letter to Governor Felix, and he doesn't glory in himself or in Felix. It's pretty military, and it's the facts. It's unassailable. Now, this is where I would normally ask for comments, and this time when I do it, I just remind people of one of my favorite artists, He Qui, I guess you pronounce it, I'm not sure, at hequiart.com. Recommend that you look at his pictures or his paintings. They're spectacular. But this is a reminder of the Prince of Peace, something that Paul is not experiencing at this moment, yet he's been visited by the Prince of Peace. Well, to finish the lesson, I've been talking about the 10 martyrs of the 20th century and the West Wing, or the West Door, unveiled in 1998. And we talked about Maximilian Kolbe, who was starved to death for another man in Poland, and Manche Masamola, who was killed by her parents because she wanted to be baptized. Yani Lumwum from Uganda, who stood up to Idi Amin against oppression and political killings. And then the Grand Duchess Elizabeth of Russia, who her husband was murdered, and then I went too far, and he was murdered, and then she opened a hospital after selling all of her property, and she was murdered by the communists in 1918. Martin Luther King Jr., who was shot and killed in 1968 for being black and for leading a movement that brought civil rights to the African Americans in the United States. And this week we talk about Oscar Romero, who is from El Salvador. He was an archbishop there, and he was appointed in 1977 and considered to be a conservative who would not rock the boat. But after 2 years, he realized that he'd lost 30 priests, killed, expelled, or forced to flee from death. There were death squads killing scores of believers. And he became an outspoken defender of human rights and the poor, and he denounced the abuses of the military. And he got little support from the other bishops. They were more worried about the Marxist revolutionaries. He was not a Marxist, and he didn't back the guerrillas, and he didn't back the military. He backed peace. He was traditional, he was pious, but he was a progressive firebrand who challenged the oppressive U.S.-backed regime in El Salvador. He told the Salvadorian soldiers, to disobey their superiors if they were ordered to attack innocent civilians. Days later, after saying this to the soldiers, he was shot to death while saying Mass. That was on March 24th, 1980. Oscar Romero. Thank you for watching. May God bless you.